Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week I wanted to talk about how I got this painting started. Stick around. So there comes a time for certain paintings where basic techniques just don't cut it for the idea that you have. And you need to shift your perspective a little bit. That's what this video is mostly about, but it's also about how I used charcoal to give myself a little bit of a base for this piece and how you can do it for your next project too. Now, the use of dried pigment alongside paint is not a new technique. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. People have been doing it for centuries. But the use specifically of charcoal here is something that I think is a technique that I think a lot of people would probably overlook because it's very non-traditional in the sense that you're not going to think to do it right out of the gate. So my current project began as a series of layered colors, beginning with yellow, coming in with a mixed orangish brown color, doing a little bit of resist and dabbing away in certain areas, a little bit of additive, subtractive kind of stuff. And as it was basically dry, I was just standing over the piece as it sat on the floor, looking at it and going, you know what? I had started another piece recently just with a pastel base, but then clear coated it before I got to the painting. I was like, why not just use something like charcoal and just mix the paint directly into that as I go? And that's sort of the birth of how that piece started. Utilizing my own decades of knowledge base in terms of how paint is made and how paint mixes and how different mediums work, I figured, you know what, a little bit of just like fluid acrylic extender should work just fine. So I put that in a little cup, grabbed a brush, and just sort of went to town, figuring out exactly how much of that medium to add, how much, how little, depending on where things are for the piece. And I really had a lot of fun just building out that first initial layer. Just working my way across the piece, sort of like from one side to the other. I found myself, finding out like exactly how much medium to add, what that consistency needs to be, and mentally taking note of all of this so I can teach it to you guys too. And with that whole process done, I am now in the stage here where I can slowly glaze in more color, bring a lot of those warm tones into everything, and I'm about to tackle some blues into the darker shadows for this, but that's for my own piece. For the next part of this, I want to show you guys how to do this yourself. Okay, so for today's demo, I've got a simple piece of 140-pound Canson XL watercolor paper down here to just give ourselves a nice simple base. Obviously, if you're doing this on canvas, the canvas texture will, be a little more amplified for spreading down whatever dry media you're working on. I also have myself some vine charcoal, also sometimes referred to as willow charcoal. This is basically just simple charred wood, and it's very thin. Well, not so thin, it's loose. A lot of the sticks are very thin. You can get thicker sticks of it, it's fine. But unlike compressed charcoal or charcoal pencils, the medium itself is really loose. You get a lot more grays, especially when spreading around paper and everything like that, and it's harder to get fine details. But for just simple base level starting a piece, this is absolutely perfect because you shouldn't be worried about details right away anyway. I do also have a piece of compressed charcoal off to the side, but I shouldn't really need that very much. So to start this off, I am just going to throw down kind of a basic, simple little landscape for me. Something, at least in my own work, I want to say generic, but something that I'm not necessarily going to take to a bigger painting, but something that will, in many ways, act as that simple base to get ourselves started. So just scribble some stuff out here, figure out, something that might look like one of my larger pieces and everything like that. Let's say maybe our light's coming from here-ish. And I'm really just looking for bigger shadow elements, major shapes, stuff like that. I'm not necessarily trying to get every single, little area and shape. A lot of that will come later. I'm just looking for those big positive and negative space ideas. If you guys have seen my videos regarding how I sketch with ink in any capacity, this is very similar. I'm just thinking about those bigger, bolder lines, areas of darks and lights. And it might seem like I'm adding a lot of dark here, but bear in mind that vine charcoal has a much darker start, but as soon as you sort of blow that pigment and that charcoal back, as well as mixing it with paint, a lot of that will come up. Just simply here, blast of compressed air in particular, all of that just sprays right away, and it's not as dark as it looks because that charcoal is just sitting on top there. So it's actually very minimal in terms of what you're putting on the piece. In this case, the paper. In the case of a larger piece, a canvas. And I don't use charcoal a ton, but I do have a fair bit of experience with it from my school days. And for simple figure work, you see it in art classrooms a lot where you're doing gesture drawing and things like that. I'm looking here mostly just for the overall movement of this piece. Now the current piece I have has a bridge on it too. Why don't I give that a bridge here with some areas, something like that. Nothing too fancy. Now with this base, I'm actually going to give that another quick blast of air. Spray that excess back. Now at this point you can add a little extra compressed charcoal if you want to define those lines and shapes a little bit more. I'm going to hold off until I start using the medium. So for this, I've got my water reservoir off to the side. I have this little plastic shot glass that I picked up at my local arts and crafts store, and I'm going to fill this with some GAC 100. Now you could do this on a palette. I feel like any small cup though would be good. I like having the reservoir of medium here, because if I decide to kind of, I'm going to be dipping back and forth, and I don't want to pollute necessarily a big pile. I'd rather just have it dissolved all together into one of those. So I've actually already got a drip down here. Got a nice small brush here, and I'm just going to start scrubbing that around using that medium. And as you kind of work that into the charcoal, that starts to pick up. And then you can start kind of working that together with the brush marks. Now obviously in this case, because I am coming on top of just a plain white background, all this is going to do is just sort of gray everything out. Because in my original piece I was working off of a pre-colored underpainting, all of the underlying oranges and yellows show through, where in this case you just see the white. So this is a lot of, just general scrubbing. The less medium you use, the more of that charcoal you'll pick up and the darker it'll be. And then obviously the more medium you use, the more it spreads out between it. And you get, something like that. So now like here, I'd like this to be a little bit darker. So I'm not going to go directly into that section of the medium, but I can lay down a bit more of the charcoal. Maybe even grab some of that compressed stuff so it's a little darker. So when I grab a bit more medium, I have a little bit more of that charcoal to work with and mix in to get those areas. And again, I'm not necessarily looking for details here. I'm just blocking out those big shapes and utilizing the charcoal as a means to fill out a bit more complexity and free up sort of my mental state a little bit. Like the overall shapes there that I can start finding, when I'm working on a landscape of any kind, I can start finding some of those ideas just with the shape of the brush and the brush marks. Again, like just scrubbing back and forth like this. Now I've got basically all these little extra cliff faces in here that I can do something with, or I can just glaze and paint over them later. It's rather free-form. But again, as you mix that medium in, you can start thinking a little bit more about the piece. You can what I appreciate about this charcoal to medium technique is that you really can start super loose and find those ideas as they come out. If obviously you have a more distinct idea going in, that's different. I'm actually going to grab a softer compressed charcoal here. I like the idea of this being like a darker cliff face, so I'm going to throw some thicker medium into that. Then come back in. So now the darker compressed charcoal obviously is more that stark black, and is going to mix down into almost like an ink as that starts to come together. And of course, again, less medium you add, you can just fill that out. But the goal overall is to make sure you are hitting all of those places of charcoal. Anything you don't hit with that brush and hit with that medium is then going to come up on your next layer of paint. Now, sometimes it can say that's a great desired look, but if you miss a spot or drag your hand across it later, you might run into a much bigger problem. So do bear that in mind as you work on whatever you happen to choose to work on for a piece like this. And I would recommend definitely a smaller brush, even on a much larger scale piece. It's the same brush I used on the giant canvas I showed earlier. That is strictly in order to, and you don't necessarily have to. You can get a bigger one. But I find that the smaller brush makes sure that you are hitting all of those spots with the medium and you're not missing anything. Obviously, the bit of glare in using the medium itself, you run into the idea of like, well, I can tell what's wet and what's not. But you can really take your sketching and your early part of that painting to a brand new level and a brand new place just by utilizing that dry media. I would be very curious to see. I guess I got to wipe the brush off here. Let's do that. Grab a Kleenex because I want to outline this a bit, or at least cover it. Get that in the background. Mountain. Just to kind of steal that away so I'm not hitting it, the next time. And I can almost just erase. I would love to see what you guys, especially those who are more, do more portrait work. I think this could be a really fun way to mess with a portrait. I need that darker compressed charcoal under here. Up along that line. I don't want to go overboard, but again, as you saw, especially working that into here, can very kind of easily pollute that. And it's really just as you do this, you will find sort of a balance, a ratio, so to speak, for what works for you in terms of how much medium to add, how much charcoal to add. It is certainly a trial and error process in many ways. I was lucky to have started trying this out on a much larger canvas because it gave me a lot of room to play and everything like that. But obviously just doing this on a simple sheet of paper, you likely will be doing it a few times before you really find something you like. But it's once again, as I'm finishing this up, if you want a way to sort of loosen up your process and find more free-form shapes and something to jumpstart your painting into a new way, I highly recommend giving this a shot. This was really a lot of fun for me to do, and actually just doing it right now, I'm struggling to talk through this process because I just kind of want to focus in on it. But at this point, I'm just trying to cover the page. There we go. I have a little excess medium sitting here. I can just brush that out. And once again, as I mentioned at the top of this, if you're it works on grayscale. It looks a bit more like a sketch this way, but if you were starting with a more colorful underpainting, this will bring in your darks, but all of those other colors will end up showing through, giving you a much more dynamic start to an individual piece. About like that. Definitely poured out a little too much medium, but that's okay. So that is a quick look on how I used charcoal to give myself a starting base layer for this landscape. But as always around here, I want to remind you guys that this is one simple technique that with a little ingenuity, you can probably take a whole lot further. And in my own work, I'm planning to do so. With any new technique, it's important to push the limits of exactly what you can do with it. And while that worked on a lighter support, I'm definitely in the mood to try it with a white Conte crayon and maybe some pastels on something a bit darker and see how that works. I also foresee some possibilities with maybe oil pastels and either an oil medium or just linseed oil and mixing that in and doing that as a base coat. Although, knowing me, I'll probably be reaching for my faster drying Galkid than I will be for a bottle of linseed oil, so it doesn't take all summer to dry. But like any one of these videos, I hope that this inspires you to challenge the traditional conventions and limitations of media and get yourself started by making all kind of crazy new work of your own. As always, if you enjoyed this, learned something, or just love hearing me talk about the process of art, go ahead and hit that like button. Let me know your thoughts in comments below. Get subscribed if you're not already, and this is Ben from Cinder Studios, reminding you to keep on creating, stay inspired, and I'll see you guys next time.